In the Hearts and Minds, Book 0, The Birth of a Hero. Story 23, Break. Do you accept guilt for breaking your contract? President Burhman was granted the use of the president's chair one last time, seated at the head of the roundish, rectangular monstrosity taking up 90% of the room. He cleared his throat. None of his board of advisors had faces. Each time he blinked, they only grew darker. So now there were nothing but globs of shadows seated around him. Yes. Please sign this statement, sir. The man who had once been vice president, and before that, vice chairman, and before that, Chief Secretary Wan bowed low. He was always so happy to bend his head, but until now, Grain hadn't thought it might be so that he could hide his face. Grain did not take the pen proffered in the soon-to-be president's grip. He forced the man to linger in a discourteous limbo. Grain felt a resulting ripple of discomfort clog the office. It smelled of musk and expensive perfume, and sweat, more sweat than usual. It clung to the air, forced everyone to wrinkle their noses just to survive it. Instead of accepting the writing utensil, Grain unearthed his own pen, a gift from his reporter. They'd been together for almost 10 years. His lover was now someone who stood burdened by the weight of gravity. Gods, but it didn't make Grain love him any less. What a relief. He wasn't some predatory cradle robber as he'd feared. He used to believe that. Truthfully, he'd suppressed his desires for so long that when he'd finally met Lim, he wondered if he'd just stopped aging in his 20s. Socially. That he was decades behind, and to fall for a pretty young thing like that was a sign of his perversion. But that thought had only come from guilt. Guilt that he hadn't realized was there until Lim had told him what it was. How one could be so wise at such a young age, Grain couldn't comprehend. On his better days, he wondered if Lim had flown down from the heavens to grant him salvation. On his worst days, he wondered just how long he would be teased with this light before it was taken from him. They'd had a good run. Grain was not one for making excuses. He was used to accepting the dirt into his hands. Perhaps he wasn't the one who'd cultivated the rotten sugar, but the responsibility was his nonetheless. Acceptance of everything but himself, Grain had never stopped to realize how skewed those scales were. But his reporter had approached him with a goal in mind, and Grain had needed only to perform it. He would have done anything to keep him. So, with the minuscule power vested in his hands, Grain and Lim had traveled Truvia. In the capital, Grain believed the gray skies encompassed the entire chunk of the country. Little did he know there were such wonders like caves and waterfalls. No, they weren't as grand or majestic as the Republic of Stufant, but they were still beautiful under the stars and shiny in the sun. Grain and his reporter had done what they could to stay under the radar of the board. It was clear that these men and women were in the pursuit of something that could not be obtained without blood. And so, Grain silently hoarded all that blood, doling it out to replenish that which had been taken. While he had never met the leader of flavors around the world, he'd learned her handwriting style. And while he had met the editor for Truvian Times, as well as 3 separate leaders of the Cane Isles, Most of their work together was performed with his face concealed, his name an alias. He and Lim had spent years traveling the country, hearing stories, stealing shipments of rotten sugar, freeing those accused of treason. He changed their arrest records to pardonable crimes, and then he, the idol, did the only thing he had the power to do: pardon. At each step, his reporter had guided him. When Grain was filled with more lies than truth, his reporter had stared right into his eyes, suggesting that he change how he looked at the frosted candidates. Go into the basement, and when you look at them, see me there instead. He had. Oh, he had. Then he'd thrown up for nearly 15 minutes straight. The thought of his reporter's arms secured to either side of those giant carts, the thought of the darkness, the drugged confusion, the scientists poking and prodding and assessing him as a marvelous specimen. It was the moment Grain's entire world came crashing down around him. He hadn't only seen Lim sitting in those vats. No. He'd seen his late mother as well. Each blink rotated between Lim and her, and this phenomenon continued months later. No doctor could cure it. None could even diagnose it, for a diagnosis would become record for his board of directors to peruse as they pleased. The president could not be anything but the peak of health. In the roiling, writhing, nauseating pits of what he later had been told was despair, Lim came to him, rubbed his back. He was owed an "I told you so," but instead of ridiculing him, he'd knocked their temples together, kissing his nose. Each night they stayed like that, the badger drowsily holding his favorite plate in his sleep on the rug. Eventually, these body quakes dissipated, and some time after that, Lim had offered a suggestion. "Will you help me?" he'd asked, holding out a hand. Grain's night vision was not great now, and it hadn't been that much better back then. All he could see in the pitch of their room was that hand, a shining beacon to haul him out of the darkness. He hadn't hesitated to hold onto it. Lim's greatest defensive weapon was the sigh. It was true. But his greatest offensive weapon was his compassion, and Grain had never stood a chance. Who could take a monster into their hands, and instead of killing it, destroying it, or annihilating it, they instead gripped it by its claws and forcibly, painfully, made the monster take one step forward? Grain was at the downward slope of his life. No matter what Lim said, he was only growing older and uglier each day. This old man, schooled by an angel. Of course, it was Grain's fault that their work had to end. He had held it together for many years, though his insides might have been entirely switched out for gold instead of steel. Gold was shiny and expensive, yes, but it was malleable, too. Grain had chosen to believe that this was superior to something that could not bend without breaking. The former president signed the document of his confession, not a word of it typed by him. Nearly 3 years ago, Fa had been destroyed, and Grain had lost his composure. It had been the final thread of trust between him and his advisors, who didn't understand his sudden need to tour the country and pardon criminals. He had broken. He'd ruined it all during his victory speech. Or at least, that's what he'd thought. Never could he have imagined his bodyguards fighting for his safety. Never could he have imagined the couple hundred gathered citizens shouting for the PAs to leave him alone. Never could he have imagined several onlookers, regular citizens all, granting him a hiding place as he ran from the venue's rioting. He was a false idol, or at least that's what he'd always believed. How could he repay this kindness, so undeserved? by becoming the idol these few believed him to be. That could only last so long, though, for there were only so many times he could exercise his power against any unsavory laws his board tried to pass. Extra taxation on the middle class, cutting business hours to times that were unmanageable for the average citizen to purchase their needs without missing work, even limiting funding for disease control research. No new vaccines had passed trials in the last 6 years, and the board believed that was a sign that those scientists should just stop trying. Meanwhile, the military received nearly 85% of all revenue. The research department for the Frosted not only gained a hefty chunk of those funds, but the ability to oversee their own research. With no third parties, nobody could poke and prod at their reports. Their methods, which had never been standardized humanely, could only grow worse without that last leash keeping them at bay. Grain had openly worked against his board. It was only a matter of time before they arranged his removal from office. He only hoped he had held them at bay long enough for the resistance forces to regroup. He only hoped the rebel cell inside the Frosted compound had made progress. With Fa destroyed, all of these forces, who had tried to stand united against the weight of Truvia's military and money, they were all disconnected, scattered, wondering how best to proceed. Too little, too late. It was too little, too late. Grain's initial purpose had been to make his reporter happy. But somewhere along the way, there was a shift. Even a monster like him had someone who would treat him with love. What about all of the people who were not yet monsters, or who would never become them? Grain wanted to make his reporter proud, but he also wanted to lift at least one burden from those who had ended up in this country because of him and all his father's lies. Too little, too late. He would die the same monster, no matter how many laws he vetoed or how many innocent civilians he pardoned. And now it was truly over. He finished his signature with an efficient flourish.